North Koreans collapsed into tears, wailing and mourning in the streets upon hearing of Kim Jong Il's death. To outsiders, such grief may appear excessive, but for the people of North Korea, they were lamenting the loss of what they believed to be a godlike figure. This small, secluded nation, armed with the ability to unleash mass destruction, continues to face hostile relations with the West and escalating global tensions. The question remains, can the Kim dynasty endure? Do its citizens truly revere their communist rulers, or is it all an elaborate performance? From its founding in 1948 to the modern-day authoritarian state, this is the story of North Korea's rise. The birth of North Korea, 1946-1953. For centuries, Korea was a unified land. But in the early 20th century, Japan seized control. By 1905, the entire peninsula was under Japanese rule. Tokyo portrayed its occupation as a civilizing mission, yet for Koreans, it was a brutal period of suppression. Thousands of resistance fighters battled against Japan until around 1910, when organized resistance collapsed and Korea was absorbed into the Japanese Empire. Like many colonies, industrialization arrived, but the benefits were reserved for the occupiers, while Koreans endured exploitation and systemic discrimination. Japan governed Korea with an iron fist, filling schools with armed instructors and enforcing obedience through an expansive militarized police force. Still, beneath the surface, the dream of independence endured. In 1919, inspired by promises of freedom after World War I, Koreans staged nationwide protests. Japan's response was merciless. In one instance, hundreds of demonstrators were locked inside a church and burned alive. Despite the brutality, Korean nationalism grew stronger, and among its loudest voices were the communists. The rise of Korean communism. During the early 20th century, communist movements surged worldwide, inspired by Lenin's revolution in Russia. To Koreans suffering under Japanese rule, communism's promises, land redistribution, an end to exploitation, and national liberation were deeply attractive. By the 1920s and 1930s, underground groups of Korean communists emerged as the spearhead of anti-Japanese resistance. Japan cracked down harshly, using firing squads, prisons, and mass terror to eliminate dissidents. Many were executed, while others fled into exile. Among them was a young man who would later become a central figure in Korean history, Kim Il-sung. The rise of Kim Il-sung. Born in 1912 near Pyongyang, Kim's childhood is clouded by propaganda, but it is believed his Christian parents fled with him to China after taking part in anti-Japanese activities. In China, Kim gravitated toward communism, joining the Chinese Communist Party in 1931. He soon took part in militant resistance after Japan invaded Manchuria. His natural leadership skills helped him rise through guerrilla ranks, scoring victories that earned him fame across East Asia. One pivotal moment came in 1937, when Kim led 200 fighters in the Battle of Pochonbo near the Korean border. They destroyed Japanese installations, including a police station, striking a symbolic blow against imperial rule. North Korean propaganda would later elevate this event as the true beginning of Kim's revolutionary journey. Kim himself described it poetically. The flames over Pochonbo's night sky signaled the dawn of Korea's liberation, long buried in darkness. Kim and the Soviets' Kim's victories earned him the nickname, the Tiger. But Japan intensified its hunt, forcing him into the Soviet Union. There, Kim officially joined the Red Army and spent much of World War II in relative obscurity. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in 1945, its forces swept into Korea from the north while American troops occupied the south. The peninsula was abruptly split at the 38th parallel, a line carelessly drawn on a map by U.S. officials in under an hour, yet destined to become one of the world's most consequential borders. Both Koreans and foreign powers wanted reunification, but under their own ideology. Stalin selected Kim Il-sung, the celebrated guerrilla commander, to lead the Soviet-backed North. In December 1945, Kim became first secretary of the Korean Communist Party, a role that cemented his grip on power for decades to come. The Kim conspiracy theory. Not everyone believed Kim's rise was authentic. A strange theory emerged that the man installed in Pyongyang was neither the same guerrilla leader from Pochonbo, but rather an imposter chosen by Stalin. Even the CIA once investigated this claim, initially concluding it was true. However, later evidence, including testimonies from Kim's wartime comrades, debunked the theory. Still, the possibility lingers in whispers. Could the Kim dynasty itself be built upon a Soviet fabrication? A divided peninsula, whether genuine or not, Kim Il-sung's authority was real, and Korea was now irrevocably divided. In the south, the United States oversaw governance, while Kim built a Soviet-style regime in the north. Though many assume Moscow pulled all the strings, modern historians recognize that from 1946 onward, Kim was steering North Korea's political direction himself. His policies were sweeping, confiscating landlords' estates and redistributing land to peasants, nationalizing industries and banks, and launching aggressive economic reforms centered on heavy industry. In 1946, he even passed laws guaranteeing equal rights for women in the workforce. Remarkably, these reforms fueled a rapid economic recovery in the North during the immediate post-war years, though tensions within the communist movement itself were far from settled. Rival communist factions in the North. In the years after World War II, North Korea's communist movement was anything but unified. Several factions competed for dominance, each pushing the country in a different direction. Kim Il-sung's faction, often called the Guerrilla Group, held the upper hand early on. These were fighters who had battled the Japanese and earned Stalin's respect. But Stalin's trust was notoriously fragile, which meant their power rested on shaky ground. Another powerful bloc was the Soviet Koreans, ethnic Koreans who had lived in the USSR and returned with Moscow's backing. Though they lacked battlefield glory, their ties to the Soviets made them dangerous rivals for Kim. Then came the Yan'an Group, communists who had fought alongside Mao in China. After Mao's victory in 1949, this faction grew in influence and threatened to steer Pyongyang toward Beijing, rather than Kim's Korea First vision. Finally, there were the South Korean communists, many of whom had fled north once U.S. forces occupied the South. Their priority was reunification of the peninsula under communist rule. Their leader, Pak Han-yong, was arguably Kim's greatest challenger. Both men had even traveled to Moscow in 1946 for Stalin to decide who should lead. Kim prevailed, but Pak's presence remained a constant shadow. Building the Korean People's Army. Kim's solution was simple: anchor his rule in the military. A lifelong guerrilla fighter, he made armed struggle central to his political identity. The founding date of his anti-Japanese resistance group, April 25th, was elevated to a national holiday. In February 1948, this force officially became the Korean People's Army, KPA. Conscription began immediately, ensuring a massive fighting force. Arming it was no easy feat, but the Soviet Union supplied tanks, aircraft, artillery, and modern weapons. By the late 1940s, North Korea commanded one of the most formidable armies in the post-war world. The birth of two Koreas. Meanwhile, the United Nations struggled to find a solution for Korea's division. The Soviets rejected UN-supervised elections, seeing the organization as a U.S. puppet. As a result, elections were held only in the South. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was declared, led by Syngman Rhee. The UN recognized this as the peninsula's sole legitimate government. The North responded swiftly. On September 9, 1948, it proclaimed itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. The Korean divide had become permanent. The Korean War, invasion. Kim wasted no time pursuing his ultimate goal: reunification by force. By 1949, most American troops had withdrawn, leaving the South poorly defended. North Korea's military superiority made victory seem inevitable. Momentum was on Kim's side. The Soviet Union had just tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly, while Mao's communists had seized China, providing another powerful ally. Stalin and Mao encouraged an invasion, though Stalin made clear the Red Army would not intervene directly. Mao even committed 50,000 Chinese troops in support. On June 25, 1950, the North struck. Tanks, planes, and infantry stormed across the 38th parallel. The South was completely outmatched. The North had twice the manpower, overwhelming air power, and nearly 300 tanks against none. Seoul fell within 5 days. South Korea's army disintegrated, with most soldiers killed, captured, or deserting. The handful of U.S. troops stationed there could do little but retreat. As the KPA advanced, they executed political opponents, anti-communist leaders, and intellectuals in the South. Kim Il-sung appeared triumphant, but the victory was short-lived. The Korean War. U.S. strikes back. The United Nations immediately condemned the invasion. Within 48 hours, it authorized a military response, led by the United States. Washington feared Korea's fall would endanger Japan and trigger a wider communist takeover across Asia. General Douglas MacArthur, hero of the Pacific in World War II, was given command of UN forces. On September 15, 1950, he launched the daring amphibious landing at Incheon, the largest since WWII. The operation shattered the KPA. Tens of thousands of North Korean troops were captured, Seoul was recaptured, and the North was pushed back to the 38th parallel. By October, UN forces had even crossed into North Korea, seizing Pyongyang and forcing Kim's regime into retreat. What had begun as Kim's greatest victory was spiraling into total collapse. The Air War. North Korea, devastated. As North Korea's ground forces crumbled, the real destruction came from above. The U.S. and its allies gained complete control of the skies, unleashing a bombing campaign of staggering scale. Entire cities were erased. Villages vanished. Pyongyang was so thoroughly bombed that almost no major structure remained standing. One U.S. general later remarked that by October 1950, they had run out of viable targets. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. More explosives were dropped on North Korea than in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. Estimates suggest up to 10% of the North's population perished. This trauma left a scar that defined North Korean attitudes toward the U.S. long after the war. Whatever the propaganda, the near-total destruction of their country explains the enduring hatred of America across North Korean society. Chinese intervention. Just as defeat seemed certain, China intervened. Beijing had warned against UN troops approaching its border. On October 25, 1950, waves of Chinese soldiers poured into North Korea, catching UN forces by surprise. The intervention turned the tide. Pyongyang was recaptured, Seoul briefly fell again, and Kim regained control of his country, though now heavily reliant on Beijing. Kim's feelings were conflicted. North Korea survived, but reunification was no longer possible. Worse, Mao and Stalin criticized his military failures, blaming the KPA for dragging the war into chaos. By early 1951, UN forces had regrouped, retaking Seoul for the final time in March. The front stabilized near the 38th parallel, where the war devolved into a brutal stalemate. Stalemate and armistice. From mid-1951 to mid-1953, the conflict resembled the trench warfare of World War I, bloody, grinding, and without major territorial gains. After failed negotiations, an armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953. It was not a peace treaty. Instead, both sides agreed to cease fire, exchange prisoners, and establish a demilitarized zone, DMZ, at the border. For 70 years since, the Korean War has technically never ended. Though major battles ceased, the peninsula has remained one of the tensest flashpoints on Earth. North Korea, reborn, 1953 to 1970. The war left the North shattered. Its economy collapsed, output dropping 75% between 1949 and 1953. Cities were reduced to rubble, the military nearly destroyed, and morale at rock bottom. Kim Il-sung responded with a vision for national rebirth. In 1953, he laid out 4 guiding principles. Strengthen the people's democratic system. In practice, intensifying communist ideology and propaganda. Rebuild the economy and improve living standards, relying on centralized planning and foreign aid. Fortify national defense, rebuilding the army, modernizing equipment, and reinforcing the border. Pursue reunification, a dream left unfulfilled but never abandoned. Purges and power consolidation reconstruction wasn't just about rebuilding cities, it was about consolidating control. Kim blamed North Korea's failures not on himself, but on his rivals. He launched massive re-education campaigns, rebuilt the Workers' Party, and orchestrated political purges. By scapegoating competing factions for the disastrous war, Kim eliminated threats to his rule. Party posts were filled with loyalists, and enemies were sidelined, imprisoned, or worse. It was a ruthless but effective strategy, one that cemented his absolute grip on North Korea for decades to come. Toward the close of the Korean War, one of Kim Il-sung's most prominent rivals, Soviet-aligned communist Ho Ka-I, fell victim to Kim's growing wrath. Accused of failing to rebuild infrastructure and restore bombed dams quickly enough, Ho was stripped of all authority. Soon after, he was reported to have taken his own life, though many believe this was simply the regime's official story. Another casualty was Pa Hun-yong, Kim's longtime opponent and leader of the Southern Communist faction. Elevated to the post of foreign minister, Pa had promised Kim that communists in the South would rally to the cause once the North advanced. When that failed to materialize, Kim removed him from office in 1953, then branded him a U.S. spy. He was paraded through a staged trial and executed in December 1955. Hundreds of others shared a similar fate in the years after the war, dismissed, imprisoned, or killed in sweeping purges. With each elimination, Kim tightened his absolute hold on North Korea. The rise of Juche. Once Kim had cleared the field of rivals, he shaped the nation around his own vision. That vision was an ideology called Juche, a philosophy introduced in a 1955 speech that would define North Korea to the present day. At its core, Juche meant self-reliance. North Korea would strive to be fully independent, militarily, economically, and socially. Cooperation with socialist allies like China or the Soviet Union was tolerated, but dependency was rejected as weakness. Economically, this meant rejecting international trade and aiming to grow its own food, mine its own resources, and build its own industries. Socially, it meant isolating citizens from foreign influence while saturating them in Juche education, reinforcing loyalty to the nation, and, by extension, to Kim himself. Though couched in Marxist-Leninist language, Juche insisted that Korean history and identity shaped the way socialism would be applied. The philosophy also drew a stark contrast with the South, portrayed as a puppet shackled to American influence. But Juche was more than policy. It was nationalism elevated to near religion. One historian described it as the belief that Korea is the center of the world. Every North Korean was expected not only to love their country, but to revere the leader as its living embodiment. The cult of Kim. To bind the state together, Kim placed himself at its core. The 20th century had already seen dictators elevated into near-divine figures, but Kim's cult of personality grew into one of the most extreme examples in history. By 1953, he had proclaimed himself Suryong, the great leader, and fashioned his image as the very soul of the nation. To insult Kim was to insult North Korea itself. Laws even forbade wrapping goods in newspapers that bore his name, or printing his portrait on low-quality paper. This personality cult, however, nearly collapsed in its infancy. The August Faction Incident. When Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union shifted sharply away from personality cults. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalinism, and Kim was summoned to Moscow for a private scolding. While he was away, rival factions in Pyongyang, Soviet-aligned and Yan-aligned communists, plotted to use Khrushchev's criticism as cover to challenge Kim. At the August Party Conference that year, leaders Pak Chung-ok and Choi Chang-ik launched open attacks, accusing Kim of tyranny, corruption, and betraying socialist ideals, but they misjudged their strength. Though backed by foreign factions, they lacked grassroots support. Kim, the guerrilla hero who had fought Japanese occupation, still commanded nationalist loyalty. To many Koreans, he represented independence, while his rivals appeared as tools of Moscow and Beijing. The attempted coup failed spectacularly. Kim rallied support, shouted down his critics, and soon purged them all. Within a few years, both Pa and Choi were dead, and the Soviet and Yanan factions were wiped out. Survivors vanished into labor camps or secret executions. By 1960, Kim ruled unchallenged. The three-year plan, 1954-1957. With political threats eliminated, Kim turned to economic recovery. In August 1953, he launched a three-year plan prioritizing heavy industry. Over 80% of investment went into mining, construction, and large-scale manufacturing, while agriculture and consumer goods lagged far behind. Official reports claimed success. By 1957, North Korea's industrial output had surpassed pre-war levels. Yet outside observers noted the statistics were heavily skewed. Heavy industry had indeed grown, but farming and fishing stagnated. Worse, a disastrous famine broke out in 1955, claiming thousands of lives. Local officials, desperate to avoid punishment, inflated crop reports, which led the state to seize more food than farmers could produce. Historians now estimate up to 800,000 people died during this hidden catastrophe. The 5-year plan and the Flying Horse Campaign. Despite the famine, the regime declared the 3-year plan a victory and launched a new 5-year plan in 1957. This phase aimed to modernize living standards while continuing rapid industrial expansion. Central to this was the Cholima movement, or Flying Horse Campaign, a massive propaganda effort urging workers to break production records. Teams of laborers competed against each other. Medals and recognition went to Cholima riders, and Kim himself toured factories and farms, delivering on-the-spot guidance that propaganda claimed could solve any problem. By 1959, Pyongyang declared the plan completed ahead of schedule. On paper, North Korea's per capita GDP exceeded the South's. In reality, statistics were manipulated. Failing sectors like agriculture and fertilizer were left out, while consumer needs like food, clothing, and housing were ignored. Malnutrition persisted, and many families lived in makeshift shelters while industrial quotas continued to soar. The Songbun caste system. Alongside economic centralization came sweeping social restructuring. In 1957, the regime introduced Songbun, a rigid class system still in force today. Citizens were classified into 3 broad groups: the core, descended from revolutionaries and peasants loyal to Kim; the wavering, who came from less politically reliable families; and the hostile, which included former landowners, religious groups, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. This classification dictated nearly every aspect of life: where one could live, what education one could receive, and even the chances of survival in times of scarcity. For Kim, it was another tool to ensure total control over society. At the very top of North Korea's rigid class hierarchy is the core class, seen as the most loyal to Kim Il-sung's regime. These individuals, descendants of revolutionaries, soldiers, and trusted families, were considered reliable allies who could be counted on until the very end. Below them, and far larger in number, stood the wavering class, which made up nearly 45% of the population. This group included people with foreign ties, families of defectors, middle-class professionals, and ordinary occupations like teachers and small traders. While not openly hostile, they were regarded as unreliable, citizens who might abandon the regime if the political or economic situation turned against it. Finally, there was the hostile class, comprising about 27% of society. This group included political prisoners, religious communities, former landowners, businessmen, and anyone with Southern connections. These people were branded untrustworthy and subject to constant surveillance. Every North Korean was assigned a place within this system, broken down further into more than 50 subcategories. Where one stood on the songbun scale determined nearly every aspect of life. A person with good songbun could access better jobs, education, food rations, and even health care. Those with poor songbun faced constant discrimination, denied opportunities, resources, and sometimes even basic survival. The state tracked each citizen from age 17 onward, maintaining detailed files. While in theory, good deeds could improve one's position, downward movement was far more common. Failing to meet work quotas, committing minor crimes, or showing even the slightest hint of disloyalty could permanently damage one's songbun. Propaganda overdrive. Alongside this strict social order came relentless propaganda. The regime bombarded citizens with the message that they were living in the greatest country in the world, a flawless paradise untouched by the problems of weaker nations. Teachers told schoolchildren that North Koreans never suffered from blindness or deafness, illnesses that supposedly belonged to the corrupt pre-revolutionary era. In this utopia, there was no alcoholism, no crime, no prostitution, and no divorce. Even homosexuality was declared non-existent, dismissed as a capitalist perversion. But behind this polished facade was a darker truth. Anything that threatened the regime's image of perfection was hidden from view. Visitors noted the eerie absence of war-wounded or disabled people in public. The implication was chilling. Those who did not fit the picture of strength and purity were removed from sight, either hidden away or eliminated entirely. Punishment and control. To maintain such an iron grip, the regime built one of the most brutal punishment systems in the world. Prisons and labor camps, modeled after Stalin's gulags, became a defining feature of North Korean life. A simple accusation, often made by someone higher up the songbun scale, was enough to condemn a person. Trials were little more than staged performances where judges denounced the accused as traitors before handing down long sentences. Almost all prisons doubled as labor camps. Inmates were forced to mine, farm, or manufacture goods for the state, their labor seen as too valuable to waste. Some facilities acted as re-education centers, kyohwaso, where prisoners were subjected to ideological indoctrination. Others were harsher control camps, kwanliso, reserved for political prisoners and those deemed beyond redemption. Conditions in these camps were horrific. Food was scarce, violence was common, and guards routinely beat prisoners. One former guard estimated that at least 1/3 of inmates suffered mutilations, losing fingers, ears, or eyes. In the eyes of the state, prisoners were not human, and human rights simply did not exist within the barbed wire. By the end of the 1950s, Kim Il-sung's grip was absolute. Political rivals were dead or imprisoned, society was reshaped around songbun, and dissenters were crushed in camps. North Korea entered the 1960s as a tightly controlled state, with Kim free to push forward his next vision for the country. The Great Leap Onward. In the new decade, Kim sought to propel North Korea into modern industrial strength. Though Juche demanded self-reliance, the reality was that Pyongyang turned abroad for equipment and technology. Surprisingly, North Korea found it cheaper to import machinery not from its communist allies but from the West, especially Japan. Billions of dollars worth of factories and equipment were bought on credit. North Korea used this to build the world's largest cement plant, along with major steel, chemical, fertilizer, and paper industries. By the mid-1960s, Western imports accounted for more than 40% of the country's trade. This unusual window of interaction didn't last. It became clear that Pyongyang had no intention of repaying its debts, and foreign creditors gradually closed their doors. But for a brief moment, North Korea had managed to fuel its industrial surge with Western technology while snubbing the Soviets. The defection of James Joseph Dresnok. This opening to the outside world also produced one of the strangest episodes of the Cold War. In 1962, an American soldier named James Joseph Dresnok defected across the Korean demilitarized zone. Dresnok's life before that moment had been filled with hardship. His parents divorced when he was young. He dropped out of high school, and after enlisting at 17, his marriage collapsed. Depressed and drinking heavily, he faced a looming court-martial while stationed in South Korea. With nothing left to lose, Dresnok ran across a minefield straight into North Korean hands. Instead of treating him as a spy, the regime accepted him. He became a teacher, married, and even starred in propaganda films playing American villains. He was one of at least 7 U.S. defectors, though some later tried to escape. Dresnok, however, remained loyal to his adopted home until his death in 2016, raising children who continue to live in North Korea today. Building the military state, even with defectors like Dresnok making headlines, Kim's real focus in the 1960s was his military. He wanted North Korea to be armed to the teeth, ready to rival both the South and its American backers. Every citizen was required to serve at least 8 years in the military. Children as young as 7 were introduced to firearms, instilling loyalty and discipline from the earliest age. Soldiers also doubled as laborers, building roads, working farms, and supporting state projects when not training. This fusion of military and economic strength became known as Byungjin, the parallel development of industry and the armed forces. For Kim, weapons and factories were inseparable, each reinforcing the other. By the late 1960s, however, Kim began purging military officers as well, removing generals and commanders to replace them with figures even more loyal. Once again, absolute control came before all else. The DMZ conflict and escalation. Inspired by the tactics of the Viet Cong, Kim Il-sung began plotting a campaign of infiltration. His vision was for small groups of guerrillas to slip across the demilitarized zone and sow chaos in the South. After more than 10 years of deadlock, it seemed he was once again prepared to gamble on war. Border incidents weren't unusual before this. There were typically a few dozen clashes each year, but in 1966, they multiplied dramatically. Skirmishes became almost a daily reality as armed groups from the north were caught inside South Korean territory. Patrols on both sides grew tense, and nervous soldiers increasingly answered minor disputes with gunfire. This escalation is sometimes referred to as the Second Korean War. In truth, there were no large decisive battles, but rather hundreds of small ambushes, raids, and exchanges of fire that steadily raised the death toll. Losses occurred on both sides, and the United States went so far as to designate the DMZ a hostile fire zone. The Blue House Raid. The most infamous episode came in January 1968, when North Korea attempted to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee. Pyongyang believed that eliminating him would destabilize the South, spark unrest, drive out American influence, and ultimately open the door for communism. On the night of January 17th, 31 specially selected North Korean commandos slipped through the DMZ. Their mission: infiltrate Seoul and storm the presidential residence, the Blue House. Each man had been thoroughly trained in stealth operations, drilled relentlessly on the attack plan, and immersed in regime propaganda. For several days, they avoided detection, until they stumbled upon 4 South Korean woodcutters. Instead of silencing them, the commandos bizarrely tried to win them over by preaching about communism and promising that liberation was near. The civilians wasted no time reporting them to the authorities. Within hours, South Korea was on full alert. Soldiers and police mobilized across the capital. Even so, the North Korean squad managed to adapt. Ditching their original plan, they disguised themselves in stolen South Korean army uniforms and marched boldly through Seoul in broad daylight. On January 20th, they came within 800 meters of the Blue House before suspicious policemen confronted them. When their cover collapsed, a firefight erupted. One officer was killed, 2 North Koreans went down, and the rest scattered. In the days that followed, an enormous manhunt ensued. Of the 31 infiltrators, only 1 made it back to the north alive. Another was captured. All others were killed. The raid was both a disaster and a warning. It showed how close North Korea had come to achieving its goal. If not for the woodcutter's warning, Seoul might have woken to a far darker reality. The USS Pueblo crisis. Barely 3 days after the Blue House incident, North Korea provoked another international crisis by seizing an American naval vessel. The USS Pueblo, a reconnaissance ship operating in what Washington insisted were international waters, was surrounded by North Korean naval and air forces. After a pursuit and gunfire that killed 1 sailor, the ship was boarded and its crew captured. News of the incident took days to confirm, leaving Washington scrambling for a response. The United States was already stretched thin by the Tet Offensive in Vietnam and feared that escalation could risk the lives of the captured sailors. While Pyongyang broadcast propaganda about its victory, the crew endured harsh conditions, interrogation, and torture. At the same time, North Korea prepared for the worst. Schools closed, food reserves were stockpiled, and citizens were evacuated to rural areas in anticipation of a possible U.S. nuclear strike. By late 1968, hundreds more infiltrators had attempted operations in the South, including attacks that killed civilians, further alienating the very population Pyongyang hoped would rise up in revolution. The international community, even North Korea's communist allies, grew uneasy. In April 1968, Soviet Premier Brezhnev openly condemned Pyongyang's provocations. By 1969, Kim Il-sung quietly scaled back his aggression. The crew of the Pueblo was released, and DMZ clashes slowly returned to their earlier, lower levels. Economic growth versus harsh reality. Despite military failures, North Korea's economy during the 1960s and early 1970s was not in shambles. In fact, its GDP per capita remained equal to or even higher than South Korea's for much of that period. Cities grew rapidly, electricity reached most households, and agricultural reforms freed millions from rural life. Education expanded dramatically, with universal schooling and over 200 universities founded. Healthcare was one of the regime's few real achievements. Although hospitals lacked resources, compulsory medical checkups and vaccination drives gave North Korea unusually high life expectancy and low infant mortality for its level of poverty. Average life expectancy reached over 70 years, a remarkable figure compared to many nations of similar economic status. But Kim's lofty promises, every family in silk clothes, tiled roof houses, and 3 hearty meals a day, remained unfulfilled. The nation had progressed, but nowhere near the utopia painted in propaganda. Economic troubles in the 1970s. By the mid-1970s, cracks in the economy began to show. The Cholima movement had driven workers to exhaustion, and production started to decline. Imports of Western machinery ground to a halt as North Korea defaulted on massive debts. The global oil crisis of 1973 made matters worse, and by 1976, Pyongyang suspended debt payments altogether. The government responded by manipulating statistics, combining high-performing industries with disastrous ones to project false success. Instead of fixing underlying weaknesses, resources were funneled into whatever sector looked good on paper. For ordinary citizens, daily life was mixed. Housing shortages were finally easing, industries had expanded, and agriculture was still functioning. But compared to South Korea's booming growth, the North was beginning to lag badly. Pyongyang's attempts to mask its struggles with flashy campaigns, such as the August 3rd consumer goods movement, a push to produce and sell cheap, unnecessary goods just to inflate GDP, only highlighted the desperation. The once promising economy was sliding into stagnation. The overworked labor force in North Korea began turning out substandard goods, which then had to be replaced with even more production, trapping the country in a cycle of worsening quality and higher demand that distorted economic figures. Meanwhile, North Korea's pride was bruised as its longtime rivals, South Korea and Japan, began experiencing rapid economic growth in the 1970s. While Seoul's economy skyrocketed, Pyongyang found itself leaning more and more on its allies, the Soviet Union and China. By the end of the decade, North Korea had essentially become dependent on Moscow, surviving on Soviet aid and political backing, while watching its southern neighbor surge ahead toward prosperity. Foreign policy shifts. The global political climate in the 1970s added new challenges. After the United States pulled out of Vietnam, Kim Il-sung floated the idea that perhaps reunification with the South was now possible. His reasoning was simple. If tiny Vietnam could defeat America, surely North Korea could do the same. Kim took this idea to Mao Zedong, but it was no longer the early 1950s. North Korea's military advantage had eroded, and America's struggles in guerrilla warfare didn't mean it couldn't win a conventional war. More importantly, Beijing still remembered that Chinese soldiers had carried much of the burden in the Korean War, saving Kim's regime from collapse. Trust in Pyongyang's military capabilities was minimal. At the same time, China had begun opening diplomatic doors to the West. By the mid-1970s, Beijing was actively seeking ways to ease tensions with Washington and build trade ties. The Nixon administration encouraged this shift, hoping to deepen the divide between China and the Soviet Union. Supporting another Korean War would have destroyed those efforts, so Kim's proposal was quietly shelved. It was becoming clear that the old model, relying on eternal solidarity with Beijing and Moscow, was falling apart. Searching for new allies, Kim Il-sung responded by seeking support outside the traditional communist bloc. Brief partnerships with fellow communists like Pol Pot in Cambodia didn't last, but Africa proved fertile ground for diplomacy. Kim cultivated friendships with strongmen such as Idi Amin and Jean Bedel Bokassa, rulers whose lust for power mirrored his own. Among the most bizarre alliances was with Francisco Macias Nguema of Equatorial Guinea, who turned his country into a brutal personal cult. Styling himself the Great Miracle, Nguema demanded priests praise him during services, while committing atrocities that shocked even by African dictatorship standards. In one horrific case, he ordered the massacre of 200 people in a football stadium while blasting pop music through the loudspeakers. Equatorial Guinea became known as the Auschwitz of Africa. As a gesture of friendship, Nguema sent his daughter, Monica, to be raised and educated in Pyongyang in 1979. The timing proved fateful. He was soon overthrown and executed. Yet Kim Il-sung honored his promise to the late dictator by ensuring Monica received the best education North Korea could offer. He even kept in touch personally, checking on her well-being. Monica, still alive today, has published books in which she defends both her father and Kim Il-sung, insisting that they were misrepresented by Western propaganda. The axe murder incident and Operation Paul Bunyan. While North Korea cultivated friendships abroad, tensions along the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, remained high. On August 18, 1976, a group of American and South Korean troops entered the Joint Security Area to trim a tree that obstructed the view of a UN observation post. Led by Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett, the men began their work under the watchful eyes of North Korean soldiers. At first, the encounter was only tense stares, but soon, the North Koreans demanded the Americans stop. When Boniface ignored them and turned his back, around 30 North Korean soldiers suddenly attacked, wielding crowbars, pipes, and even the axes the Americans had been using. Captain Boniface was beaten to death on the spot, while Lieutenant Barrett fled into a ditch only to be hunted down and killed with the same axes. Both men carried weapons but never drew them, likely fearing gunfire would escalate the situation. North Korean media immediately twisted the incident as American aggression, and allies of Pyongyang echoed the false narrative. But photos, video, and eyewitness testimony quickly exposed the truth. Washington, however, refused to let the murders go unanswered. Without triggering a full-scale war, the U.S. sought a show of overwhelming force. Thus was born Operation Paul Bunyan. Named after the giant lumberjack of American folklore, the operation's sole objective was to cut down that very tree, while daring Pyongyang to interfere. The U.S. assembled an extraordinary show of power. Hundreds of armed soldiers, martial arts experts, armored vehicles, helicopters, bombers, fighter jets, and even the USS Midway aircraft carrier positioned offshore. Practically every American and Allied base in East Asia went on alert. Under this massive cover of force, a small team re-entered the DMZ. Surrounded by circling helicopters and warplanes, they chopped the tree down in just 45 minutes. North Korean troops, heavily outnumbered, could only stand by and watch. Operation Paul Bunyan was declared a success. Today, a memorial stands on the site to honor Boniface and Barrett. North Korea never issued an outright apology, but Kim Il-sung expressed regret and stressed the need to avoid future escalations, the closest Pyongyang had ever come to admitting fault in its history up to that point. The Flagpole War. The DMZ remained a flashpoint, though later disputes were sometimes petty. One infamous example was the Flagpole War of the 1980s. South Korea erected a 98-meter flagpole near the border to showcase its national flag. Not to be outdone, the North responded with a colossal 160-meter flagpole, topping the South's by a wide margin. The North Korean flag alone weighed nearly 600 pounds. To this day, that massive flagpole remains the tallest in the world, a symbol of North Korea's vanity. Rise of Kim Jong Il. By 1980, Kim Il-sung was approaching 70 years old. The economy had stalled, foreign policy was gridlocked, and the regime faced uncertainty about what would happen once the great leader died. His answer was succession, grooming his son, Kim Jong Il, to take over. Born in 1941 in a Soviet military camp, Kim Jong Il spent much of his early life hidden behind layers of mythology invented by state propaganda. He began quietly entering politics in the 1970s, joining the Central Committee in 1972, and being named his father's heir by 1974. Tasked with overseeing espionage and propaganda, he steadily accumulated power behind the scenes. By the 1980s, his portrait appeared alongside his father's in every North Korean home, and he was officially hailed as the party center, the figure who would ensure the revolution's survival after Kim Il-sung. Kidnapping for Cinema One of Kim Jong-il's earliest assignments was reshaping North Korean propaganda. Despite his official disdain for Western culture, he was a notorious cinephile with a massive collection of foreign films, something that would have been a crime for ordinary North Koreans. His dream was to create a communist version of Hollywood, producing films that glorified Kim Il-sung and the revolution. The problem was simple. North Korea lacked the talent to make movies that could rival the quality of Western cinema. Kim Jong-il experimented with filmmaking during the 1970s, but any applause his works received was staged. He knew he lacked the talent to realize his dream of turning North Korea into a cinematic powerhouse, so he looked abroad for the people who could. In January 1978, North Korean operatives abducted renowned South Korean actress Choi Eun-hee in Hong Kong. She was forced onto a boat and taken to Pyongyang, where, despite her captivity, she was treated as a guest. Choi toured theaters and cultural venues and was even introduced to Kim Il-sung himself. 6 months later, North Korean agents seized another high-profile target in Hong Kong, film director Shin Sang-ok, who happened to be Choi's ex-husband. The abductions were deliberate. Kim Jong-il wanted the two reunited and compelled to create films under his direction. After multiple escape attempts failed, The pair gave up and eventually remarried. For the next 8 years, they produced movies for the regime. Many were exactly what you'd expect: dramatizations of Kim Jong Il's own scripts or glorified accounts of Kim Il-sung's struggle against Japan. Choi even won an award for portraying a peasant woman who joins the communists in Japanese-occupied China. Yet the most infamous production was post-WWII, essentially a North Korean version of Godzilla. The story featured a magical dragon that topples a corrupt emperor. Surprisingly, even Japanese actor Kenpachiro Satsuma, who once played Godzilla himself, admitted that post-WWII was better than some of the official Godzilla movies. But the couple never stopped being prisoners. While in Vienna in 1986 to secure funding for another project, Choi and Shin managed to evade their guards and flee to the U.S. Embassy, finally gaining their freedom. North Korea's film industry never again reached the strange heights of post-WWII. The abduction and seed-bearing programs. Choi and Shin weren't the only ones abducted during this era. Throughout the 1970s, North Korea kidnapped hundreds of foreigners, most from Japan, but also from countries such as France and Malaysia. Victims ranged from couples to lone travelers, even children as young as 13. Once brought to North Korea, captives were often separated, indoctrinated, and then paired off to start families. The real aim was chilling: to raise children who could serve as ethnically ambiguous spies for Pyongyang. Since marriages between North Koreans and foreigners were forbidden, these children offered the regime a way to insert agents into foreign societies without being immediately recognized as North Korean. A related tactic was the so-called seed-bearing program. Young North Korean women were sent abroad to seduce influential foreigners, politicians, businessmen, and diplomats. If they became pregnant, the regime could use the child as leverage, blackmailing the father into providing concessions or support. Both schemes had the same end goal: to cultivate operatives who could blend seamlessly into other countries. To this day, the true scale and success of these operations remain unclear. North Korea only admitted to some abductions in 2002 during talks with Japan, claiming just 13 victims. Survivors and investigators suggest the real number was far higher. 5 abductees were returned that year, but the fate of many others, and their children, remains unknown. The Rangoon bombing, 1983. North Korea's behavior only grew darker in the 1980s, reflecting Kim Jong Il's growing influence. 2 notorious terrorist attacks shocked the world and further isolated the regime. The first was an attempt to assassinate South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan during a visit to Rangoon, today's Yangon, Myanmar. On October 9, 1983, Chun was scheduled to attend a wreath-laying ceremony at the Martyrs' Mausoleum. At 10:25 a.m. before he arrived, a powerful bomb planted by North Korean agents detonated, destroying the site. The blast killed 21 people and wounded 46, including high-ranking South Korean ministers, journalists, and Burmese civilians. Chun narrowly survived only because his motorcade was delayed in traffic. Investigators quickly identified 3 North Korean military operatives who had entered Burma through a diplomatic channel. When police moved in, one was killed in a shootout after killing 3 officers, while the other 2 attempted suicide with a grenade. Both survived, though one later confessed and implicated Pyongyang directly. The attack horrified the world. Not only had North Korea tried to assassinate a head of state, but it had done so on neutral soil at a sacred national site. Korean Air Flight 858, 1987. The second, even more horrific act occurred 4 years later. On November 29, 1987, 2 North Korean operatives boarded Korean Air Flight 858, disguised with Japanese passports and fluent in Japanese, a skill they had learned from abducted Japanese victims. The flight was traveling from Baghdad to Seoul with multiple stopovers. Before leaving the plane in Abu Dhabi, the agents hid a bomb disguised as a radio in the overhead luggage. Hours later, as the plane flew over the Andaman Sea, the device exploded, killing all 115 people on board. The agents tried to escape, but were caught in Bahrain. Both attempted suicide with cyanide pills, but only one succeeded. The survivor, Kim Jong-Il, confessed under interrogation. Taken as a teenager, she had been indoctrinated through North Korea's spy program and ordered by Kim Jong Il himself to carry out the attack. The bombing was intended to frighten the world away from attending the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Kim Jong-il was sentenced to death in South Korea, but later pardoned on the grounds that she was as much a victim of brainwashing as an accomplice. The decision sparked controversy, but she has since publicly renounced the regime and expressed remorse. She lives under constant security, fearing retaliation from both North Korea and grieving families. The downing of Flight 858 marked one of North Korea's deadliest crimes since the Korean War. Outrage swept the globe, and the United States officially declared North Korea a state sponsor of terrorism. Pyongyang, as always, denied responsibility, but the evidence was overwhelming. Mega projects in the 1980s. The 1980s were a difficult decade for North Korea internationally, and the regime tried to mask these external troubles by investing in massive domestic projects. Some had genuine utility, others were purely symbolic, and a few turned into costly embarrassments. Perhaps the most successful undertaking was the Nampo Dam on the country's west coast. Constructed between 1981 and 1986 at a cost of around $4 billion, this huge tidal barrier cut off the Taedong River from the Yellow Sea. Its purpose was to stop seawater from polluting the river, ensuring a steady supply of clean water for homes, factories, and farms. Technically, it was a remarkable achievement, and today it remains one of North Korea's prized engineering feats, celebrated in state propaganda and even shown off to tourists. But not every project had the same level of practicality. The Juche Tower in Pyongyang, rising 560 feet into the sky, was little more than a monument to the regime's ideology. Built as a gift for Kim Il-sung's 70th birthday, it stands as a symbol of the Kim dynasty's cult of personality. Impressive in scale, yes, but ultimately just a political statement carved in stone. And then came the most infamous of all, the Ryugyong Hotel. Designed to be a futuristic pyramid-shaped skyscraper over 1,000 feet tall, it was supposed to showcase North Korea as a modern, international destination. Plans included casinos, luxury suites, and restaurants meant to lure foreign investors. Instead, it became a bottomless pit of wasted resources. Launched in 1987 and timed for Kim Il-sung's 80th birthday in 1992, the project soon stalled due to planning flaws and financial strain. To this day, the hotel remains unfinished, looming over Pyongyang, not as a beacon of progress, but as a stark reminder of the regime's extravagance, in a time when ordinary citizens were sliding deeper into poverty. Collapse of global communism. While North Korea poured money into vanity projects, the outside world was changing rapidly. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union began pulling away from hardline allies, urging them to ease authoritarian control. In 1987, Moscow's decision to send a delegation to South Korea was a direct blow to Pyongyang's long-standing hostility toward the South, forcing North Korea to reluctantly explore limited diplomatic talks of its own. Meanwhile, China under Deng Xiaoping loosened state control and pursued market reforms, opening its doors to Western trade. For Beijing, North Korea became more of a diplomatic burden than an asset. Though China continued supplying aid, it grew less willing to defend Pyongyang on the world stage. The final blow came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Practically overnight, North Korea lost its most important ally and economic lifeline. As communism crumbled worldwide, Pyongyang doubled down on isolation, insisting that its ideology of Juche, self-reliance, would be the shield that kept North Korea alive while others faltered. Ironically, they weren't entirely wrong. Opening the country to reform could have destroyed the very system that kept the Kim dynasty in power. The nuclear gambit. As the Cold War ended, North Korea looked increasingly vulnerable. To protect itself, the regime turned toward nuclear technology, With Soviet help, they had built reactors years earlier, but transforming them into weapons-grade facilities was another matter. The U.S. grew alarmed and pressed North Korea to allow international inspections in the early 1990s. Officially, Pyongyang insisted its nuclear program was for energy production, especially since the collapse of the USSR had crippled its fuel supplies. But the risk of a weapons program was obvious. In 1993, when North Korea abruptly pulled out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the world faced its first major nuclear scare of the post-Cold War era. Threats poured out of Pyongyang, including one diplomat's chilling warning that North Korea could turn Seoul into a sea of fire. In reality, their capabilities were far behind their rhetoric, but tensions soared. The crisis only cooled when former U.S. President Jimmy Carter traveled to Pyongyang in 1994 and persuaded Kim Il-sung to freeze the weapons program in exchange for American assistance with safer, non-military reactors. For a moment, it seemed like North Korea might finally be opening to cooperation. Kim even agreed to host a summit with South Korea's president in July 1994, a groundbreaking step in inter-Korean diplomacy. But history would take a different turn. Death of Kim Il-sung. On July 7, 1994, just weeks before the planned summit, Kim Il-sung collapsed at his residence after suffering a massive heart attack. Despite frantic efforts by the nation's top doctors, he was declared dead the following day at the age of 82. The state had long prepared for this moment, with detailed plans for mourning ceremonies and a highly choreographed funeral. Still, tradition dictated that the announcement be delayed 34 hours. When the news finally broke, factories halted, schools gathered students for the announcement, and neighbors huddled around radios and televisions. Across the nation, people wept openly at statues and shrines dedicated to the only leader they had ever known. To outsiders, the grief appeared staged, citizens fearful of punishment for failing to cry hard enough. Others, however, argue that the emotions were genuine. After decades of indoctrination and life lived entirely within the Kim dynasty's cult, many North Koreans truly felt their world collapse with Kim's death. The funeral drew an estimated 2 million mourners to Pyongyang. Kim's embalmed body was placed in a glass coffin at the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, where it remains on display. He was also given the eternal title of President of the Republic, enshrining him in the nation's ideology forever. Reflection on Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung's passing marked the end of an era. For nearly 50 years, he had dominated every aspect of life in North Korea, molding the country to his vision. His influence had been so absolute that it is difficult to separate the history of the nation from the man himself. By the 1990s, however, his failures were plain. South Korea had surged ahead in technology, wealth, and global standing, while the North lagged behind, trapped by outdated Soviet-era systems. The dream of reunification under Pyongyang's leadership had faded into fantasy. To some, Kim was a tyrant whose wars, purges, and policies condemned millions to suffering and death. To others inside the country, he remained a revered figure. Whatever the perspective, his impact on the Korean peninsula and the world was undeniable. The rise of Kim Jong Il. Although Kim Il-sung's death came suddenly, his son Kim Jong Il had been groomed for leadership for years. Still, he lacked his father's revolutionary credentials and battlefield legacy. To secure loyalty, propaganda had to fill in the gaps. The myths surrounding him grew increasingly absurd. State media claimed he was born on a sacred mountain, heralded by a new star in the sky. His mood was said to alter the weather. He was credited with writing hundreds of operas, film scripts, and ideological works, portrayed as a genius of culture and politics. The tales only became more ridiculous. He supposedly bowled a perfect 300 in his very first game, hit 11 holes in one during his first round of golf, and then retired from the sport because no one could surpass him. Even his bodily functions were elevated. Propaganda declared he never needed to use the toilet like ordinary humans. In one bizarre claim, North Korean media even suggested he invented the hamburger, which they described as a revolutionary snack of meat between two pieces of bread. To the outside world, these stories were laughable. But inside North Korea, they reinforced the image of a man who was more than human, the heir to the eternal leader and the new center of national life. Kim Jong Il's hidden life. Very little concrete information exists about Kim Jong Il's personal world. What we do know paints a contradictory picture. He maintained several mistresses and fathered at least 6 children, possibly more, though many details remain uncertain. Despite cultivating an image of absolute devotion to North Korea's ideology, Kim privately indulged in a love of Western cinema, an open secret in Pyongyang and one of the rare glimpses into his private tastes. State propaganda tried to portray him as extraordinary, but real life was about to test those claims. The Famine Years. The Arduous March. By the mid-1990s, North Korea was in crisis. Isolation, crippling debt, fuel shortages, and years of economic stagnation had left the nation extremely fragile. It would have taken an exceptional leader to navigate these challenges, and Kim Jong Il was not that leader. The country's collectivized farming system was already inefficient, leaving little margin for error. Then, in 1994, devastating floods destroyed crops across the nation. With Soviet aid long gone, North Korea slid into one of the worst humanitarian disasters of its history, later known, euphemistically, as the Arduous March. Hundreds of thousands starved. Families relied on the black market for survival, though corruption and exploitation flourished. Movement between towns technically required state permits, but desperate people wandered illegally in search of food, overwhelming local authorities. Riots broke out in Hamhung and Sinuiju. Gangs of starving orphans roamed city streets, scavenging for scraps. The famine also shook political stability. In 1995, a group of senior army officers in famine-stricken Hamhung secretly discussed removing Kim from power. Security forces quickly discovered the plot. All participants were executed. Kim, for his part, minimized the disaster. In a 1996 speech, he described it vaguely as a food problem, blaming local officials for failing to instill proper socialist values rather than acknowledging systemic failure. He offered no real solutions. Even food shipments from China were resisted, as Kim feared accepting aid would weaken the country's dignity. The Simwajo and the crackdown. By 1997, drought made the famine even worse. Instead of addressing the root problem, Kim prioritized protecting the regime's image. Publicly mentioning starvation or famine was outlawed. To enforce silence, he created the Simwajo, a secret police unit tasked with erasing dissent during the crisis. Their brutality was legendary. The party's own agricultural secretary was executed by firing squad, the general secretary was tortured to death, and countless regional officials vanished. In total, at least 10,000 were killed, and another 15,000 imprisoned in camps under Simwajo's orders. Despite the repression, outside NGOs and observers exposed the truth. International pressure eventually forced Pyongyang to accept foreign food aid by the late 1990s. Only then did the famine ease, but not before an estimated 220,000 to 3.5 million people had died, depending on the source. The Battle of Yeonpyeong, 1999. As famine raged, North Korea sought new ways to secure resources. One flashpoint came in the Yellow Sea, where the 1953 armistice had left disputed waters and valuable fishing grounds under South Korean control. In June 1999, North Korean fishing fleets and patrol boats began crossing into contested waters near Yeonpyeong Island. South Korea responded with its own patrols, leading to tense standoffs. For days, both sides sent more ships, escalating with heavily armed torpedo boats. At first, the clashes were limited to ramming tactics. But on June 15th, a North Korean patrol boat, encircled by South Korean vessels, panicked and opened fire. The exchange lasted 15 minutes. By the end, one North Korean ship was sunk, 5 were damaged, and at least 17 sailors killed. South Korea, by contrast, suffered only minor injuries. North Korean propaganda later declared victory, claiming to have sunk 10 South Korean warships, a complete fabrication. In truth, the battle showed how vulnerable Pyongyang's forces were compared to the South. Songun, military first. The humiliation at Yeonpyeong only deepened Kim's obsession with the military. Though he had never fought in a war himself, he had been promoted to top military positions since the 1980s, becoming Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army in 1991. Out of this came Songun, or the military first policy. Under this doctrine, the army was not just the defender of the nation, but the guiding model for society itself. Discipline, loyalty, and obedience were to be mirrored by civilians. Propaganda glorified soldiers as the true vanguard of the revolution, placing their needs above all else, even the suffering population. Market reforms and retreat. Kim also experimented briefly with limited economic adjustments. In 2002, the government introduced the July 1st measures. These legalized some private markets, allowed managers to purchase goods more freely, and even adjusted food prices to reflect market value. Foreign media hailed it as reform. In reality, it was simply the formalization of black market trading that had existed for years. A bigger step came in 2004 with the Kaesong Industrial Park, a joint project with South Korea where Southern companies could hire cheap Northern labor, while Pyongyang pocketed the wages. These moves seemed like small openings, but Kim quickly grew wary. Within a few years, crackdowns returned, and most North Koreans were once again banned from market activity. The government's fear of losing control outweighed any real interest in reform. Branded an axis of evil. On the world stage, North Korea's reputation worsened. In 2002, U.S. President George W. Bush named Pyongyang part of an axis of evil, alongside Iraq and Iran. Coming after the 9/11 attacks, the label painted North Korea as a potential sponsor of terrorism. Defectors added to the scrutiny. Former prisoner Lee Soon-ok, who had endured 5 years in a North Korean labor camp, testified before the U.S. Congress in 2002. Her harrowing accounts of torture, forced labor, public executions, and compulsory abortions revealed the regime's brutality to the world. Nuclear escalation. Despite an agreement in 1994 to freeze its nuclear program in exchange for aid, North Korea quietly pressed ahead. By 2002, U.S. intelligence suspected the country had at least one nuclear weapon. The first confirmed test came in October 2006, marking North Korea as a nuclear power. Yet even then, the weapons could not solve the nation's ongoing economic collapse. In 2007, under pressure from the U.S., China, South Korea, Japan, and Russia, Pyongyang agreed to shut down its Yongbyon reactor in return for aid. But the deal quickly unraveled. North Korea refused outside inspections, resumed weapons testing, and restarted its reactor. The currency crisis of 2009. Perhaps the greatest blunder of Kim's rule came not from war or famine, but from money. In late 2009, Pyongyang abruptly reissued its currency, declaring all old banknotes invalid. Citizens were given a very short time to exchange their money, with strict daily limits. The aim was to crush inflation and wipe out savings accumulated through black market trading. The result was chaos. Prices skyrocketed, shops shut down, and food shortages worsened. Kim compounded the disaster by keeping government wages at the same numerical value as before, effectively increasing them by 10,000% overnight. The economy nearly collapsed. For the first time, open criticism of the regime appeared inside North Korea. Even loyal workers grumbled. Diplomats privately admitted the government had no idea what it was doing. The backlash was so severe that Pyongyang had to roll back the reforms within months. Several officials were executed as scapegoats, and the entire debacle was erased from state records. Historians later described it as one of Kim Jong Il's most catastrophic failures, and perhaps the closest North Korea has ever come to imploding from within. Skirmishes with South Korea domestic crises didn't stop Pyongyang from stirring up trouble abroad. Kim Jong Il still clung to his long-standing dispute over fishing rights in the Yellow Sea, and clashes soon erupted. In November 2009, North and South Korean naval forces exchanged gunfire near Daecheong Island, leaving an unclear number of North Korean casualties. With tensions simmering in the region, South Korea kept its navy close at hand. Among those vessels was the ROK's Cheonan. On the night of March 26, 2010, disaster struck. The Cheonan was suddenly torn apart by a massive explosion near Baekneung Island. Within minutes, the vessel split in two and sank. Of its 104 sailors, 46 perished. The tragedy puzzled investigators. No hostile ships had been reported in the area. A multinational investigation later concluded that a North Korean submarine had fired a torpedo, fragments of which were recovered from the seabed. Pyongyang denied involvement, and both China and Russia echoed its denials. Alternative theories emerged, claiming the ship struck a mine or collided with the seabed. Even today, academics remain divided, though Seoul and its allies stand firm that North Korea was behind the sinking. The incident sent inter-Korean relations into free fall. The following months brought further clashes, most dramatically at Yeonpyeong Island. In response to South Korean military drills, the North unleashed nearly 200 artillery shells on the island, striking homes and bases. 4 South Koreans were killed and 20 wounded. The South retaliated, killing around 10 North Korean soldiers before the skirmish ended. Each side blamed the other, Pyongyang claiming provocation, Seoul accusing the North of unprovoked aggression. Kim Jong Il's personal involvement seems highly likely. He had visited one of the artillery bases responsible the day before the bombardment, and such a bold strike would almost certainly have required his approval. Yet before long, fate would intervene. Death of a dictator. In December 2011, the Kim dynasty was shaken once more. On the 19th, state media announced that Kim Jong Il had died of a heart attack 2 days earlier while traveling on his personal train. South Korean intelligence doubted the official version, noting that his train hadn't moved at the time, but whatever the truth, the regime buried it along with him. The country erupted in orchestrated mourning. Weeping crowds filled the streets, and his funeral became a grand performance of grief. How genuine these tears were remains debated. Unlike his father, who had forged his rule by expelling occupiers and confronting foreign powers, Kim Jong Il left behind a legacy of famine, economic decline, and isolation. North Korea under him had become a pariah, mocked internationally, except when it rattled its nuclear saber. Still, the propaganda machine elevated him in death just as it had in life. According to state accounts, storms paused, and the heavens glowed red at his passing. He was posthumously honored as Grand Marshal, a final symbol of his military-first ideology. But with his death came uncertainty. The next heir, Kim Jong Un, was young, untested, and largely unknown to the outside world. The rise of Kim Jong Un, unlike his father, Kim Jong Un was not the original successor. That role once belonged to his half-brother Kim Jong-nam, until he embarrassed the family by being caught in Japan with a fake passport on his way to Disneyland in 2001. Kim Jong-un had spent much of his youth abroad, studying in Switzerland and Germany during the 1990s. Friends and teachers remembered him as a quiet, polite boy who loved basketball and video games, hardly the makings of a dictator. Yet fate pulled him back to Pyongyang, where he studied at Kim Il-sung University. For years, little was known about him until 2008, when his father suffered a stroke and succession planning became urgent. By 2009, whispers spread through the party ranks that Jong-un had been chosen. By 2010, he was suddenly thrust into public life, promoted to 4-star general despite no military service, and appearing alongside his father at official events. Propaganda hinted at his role as heir, though he was never officially confirmed before Kim Jong Il's sudden death. His rise to power was swift, unexpected, and for many within the regime and the world, unsettling. Cyber warfare and global impact. The cyber strike lasted over 7 hours before being brought under control, and several days passed before it was fully neutralized. In that window, the attack inflicted billions of dollars in damages. Today, the world takes Pyongyang's cyber capabilities far more seriously, as governments understand that it is only a matter of time before North Korean hackers launch another devastating offensive. Education in North Korea. Maintaining a force of skilled hackers requires a foundation in education, and this has been a priority of the regime since its early years. In 1959, North Korea introduced universal schooling, offering 11 years of free education that even covered textbooks, uniforms, and supplies. Official reports claim near total enrollment across the country, and while some children inevitably slip through the cracks, most evidence suggests that North Korea has indeed made education widely accessible. In 2012, Kim Jong Un adjusted the system to provide 12 years of schooling, divided into 6 years of elementary, 3 of middle school, and 3 of high school. Naturally, ideology plays a major role in classrooms. Revolutionary history and the achievements of the Kim Dynasty are core subjects, but alongside the propaganda, children also learn mathematics, literacy, and other skills comparable to international standards. Higher education, however, is more narrowly focused. North Korea's insular nature limits academic freedom, so universities concentrate on producing graduates with practical expertise, especially in areas that benefit the military. The crown jewel of higher learning is Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang, which enrolls around 16,000 students. In recent years, limited academic exchange has been allowed. A few hundred foreign students, mostly from China, study in the DPRK under heavy supervision, while select North Korean students are permitted to study abroad. This is recognition that the country cannot provide the same depth of education available overseas, even though officials hope these young scholars will bring back useful knowledge and skills to strengthen the state. Tourism and tight control. Since 2013, North Korea has permitted foreign tourists under heavily controlled circumstances. These are not typical vacations. Government minders accompany groups at all times, and every step of the itinerary must be followed precisely. Guests typically stay at the Yanggakdo International Hotel in Pyongyang, which boasts amenities like a restaurant, sauna, and swimming pool. Yet, many visitors remain uneasy, knowing they are constantly monitored. Rumors persist that the off-limits 5th floor is used for surveillance operations. Tourists are taken to showcase sites, enormous statues of the Kim family, monumental works like the Nampo Dam, and newly built resorts or theme parks meant to highlight state progress. Despite the strict oversight, many travelers report that ordinary North Koreans appear friendly and curious, though always cautious about what they say. The program gives citizens rare glimpses of foreigners, chipping away at propaganda that paints outsiders as villains. The Otto Warmbier tragedy. The risks of tourism became tragically clear in 2016 with the case of Otto Frederick Warmbier, a young American student who visited Pyongyang on a guided tour. As his group prepared to depart, security officers suddenly detained him. Authorities accused him of stealing a propaganda poster from his hotel, an act considered a crime against the state. Warmbier appeared in a forced confession video, claiming he had been coerced by the U.S. government. He was sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. Months later, he fell into a coma under mysterious circumstances, with North Korea blaming food poisoning. When he was finally released in 2017 after U.S. negotiations, he was unresponsive, sustained by a feeding tube, and showing severe brain damage. He died shortly after returning home. Reports suggest he may have been tortured, with some witnesses claiming they saw a young man matching his description left unconscious after brutal treatment. North Korea denied responsibility, framing itself as the victim of foreign slander. His case remains a chilling reminder of the risks outsiders face in the DPRK. The struggle to escape with such harsh conditions, many North Koreans dream of escape. Defection has been a constant since the state's founding, though success rates fluctuate depending on border security. In 2022, only 67 people managed to flee to South Korea. Crossing the DMZ is nearly impossible, guarded by soldiers, fences, landmines, and watchtowers. The northern border with China offers more chances, with rugged terrain and cliffs providing some cover. Bribing guards can sometimes work, but even in China, defectors remain in danger, as Beijing's policy is to deport them back to Pyongyang. The safest route requires traveling through China to Southeast Asia, often Thailand or the Philippines, where escapees can then apply for asylum and relocation to South Korea. Those caught face brutal consequences, ranging from execution on the spot to imprisonment in labor camps. Activist networks still work to help defectors, but success rates have dropped dramatically under Kim Jong Un's stricter border controls. The assassination of Kim Jong Nam. Even members of the ruling family are not safe. Kim Jong Un's half-brother, Kim Jong Nam, once considered heir, lived abroad after being sidelined. He openly criticized the regime, predicting North Korea would collapse without reform. In February 2017, while at Kuala Lumpur Airport, 2 women attacked him with VX nerve agent, one of the deadliest chemical weapons in existence. Within minutes, he was dead. The women claimed they believed they were part of a prank show and had unknowingly been manipulated by North Korean agents. While charges against them were dropped, those believed to have orchestrated the attack were never apprehended. Diplomacy with Donald Trump. International relations with North Korea shifted again in 2016 when Donald Trump became U.S. president. Known for his unorthodox style, Trump engaged in open threats on Twitter, mocking Kim Jong Un as Little Rocket Man. Yet, this unexpected approach soon gave way to unprecedented diplomacy. In 2018, North Korea participated in the Seoul Winter Olympics, sparking renewed inter-Korean dialogue. That same year, Kim met Trump in Singapore, where they pledged to work toward denuclearization. Another meeting followed at the DMZ in 2019, marking the first time a sitting U.S. president set foot in North Korea. Despite the historic optics, talks fell apart. By late 2019, North Korea had resumed missile testing, unwilling to compromise on its nuclear ambitions. North Korea and COVID-19. Ironically, North Korea's extreme isolation became an advantage during the early COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020 and 2021, the government claimed 0 cases, though outsiders doubted this. Strict lockdowns were enforced, and even suspected patients were quarantined under military control. When an outbreak was suspected in Kaesong, the entire city was sealed for weeks. Reports emerged of harsh punishments for breaking movement restrictions, including executions. Borders closed completely, halting nearly all trade and travel. By May 2022, Pyongyang finally admitted to its first official cases, declaring a national emergency. The outbreak spread rapidly, with millions reportedly infected. Official statistics claimed only 74 deaths, a figure most experts doubt, though many agree that North Korea may have avoided the catastrophic toll seen elsewhere, partly because the outbreak coincided with the less deadly Omicron variant. North Korea in 2023. Today, North Korea remains as unpredictable as ever. The regime continues missile tests and issues fiery threats against its enemies, though little has changed in substance. In May 2023, it attempted to launch its first spy satellite, but the rocket failed shortly after takeoff, plunging into the sea. The country stays locked in its familiar cycle of isolation, propaganda, and confrontation, with no clear sign of transformation on the horizon. North Korea's present and future North Korea attempted another satellite launch in August, only to suffer yet another failure. Few doubt they will continue testing until they succeed. Around the same time, the regime made headlines for a very unusual incident: the defection of an American soldier across the border. Private Travis King, stationed in South Korea, was on a guided border tour when he suddenly bolted from his group and crossed into North Korean territory. He claimed racism and mistreatment in the United States had driven him to defect, but in reality, he was likely trying to escape disciplinary action for assault charges in South Korea. After weeks in North Korean custody, King was released back to U.S. authorities in September. His legal fate now rests with the American justice system. Pyongyang has also remained in the news for its alignment with Moscow. In September, Kim Jong Un met with Vladimir Putin, reportedly discussing potential arms supplies to support Russia's war in Ukraine. Kim frames the conflict the same way Putin does: an indirect confrontation with the United States and NATO. While the world looks very different from the 1950s, North Korea and Russia still cast themselves as partners in a prolonged struggle against Western powers. As for North Korea's long-term future, opinions remain divided. Some argue the country faces two stark paths: reform or collapse. Maintaining the status quo risks economic implosion, yet reforms, if mishandled, could destabilize the regime itself. Back in 2011, Kim Jong Nam, the late half-brother of Kim Jong Un, observed that, without reforms, the economy will fail, but reforms themselves carry the danger of collapse. That tension still defines Pyongyang's dilemma today. Kim Jong Un has signaled small changes, promoting tourism, modernizing education, and allowing limited exposure to foreign culture and technology. But these steps are overshadowed by the regime's heavy surveillance, tighter border controls, and persistent nuclear threats. For now, the old system still dominates. Meanwhile, the contrast between the two Koreas has never been greater. South Korea's per capita income is roughly 15 times higher than the North's, the largest wealth gap between any two neighboring countries in the world. By comparison, the economic divide between East and West Germany before reunification was only 3-1. It is no wonder defectors from the North often describe entering the South as overwhelming cultural and economic shock. Predicting North Korea's trajectory has always been a fool's game. Despite decades of speculation, the regime continues to survive, neither collapsing nor reforming in any meaningful way. For now, Pyongyang remains firmly in place, isolated, struggling, but stubbornly enduring. Whether it eventually reforms, crumbles under its own failures, or continues drifting as a relic of the Cold War is a question only the future will answer. North Korea's story is one of resilience, contradiction, and isolation. From grand construction projects that became symbols of both pride and waste, to the collapse of its communist allies, the nation has continually faced change, yet resisted it at every turn. Nuclear ambitions and propaganda have shielded the regime from collapse, but they have also deepened its isolation from the modern world. Today, Pyongyang still clings to its old allies in Russia and China, while standing in stark contrast to the prosperity of South Korea. The Kim dynasty has endured through decades of famine, political upheaval, and global hostility, proving that predictions of sudden collapse are rarely accurate. Yet the widening economic gap, the pressure of international sanctions, and the demands of a changing world may eventually test the limits of the regime's survival. For now, North Korea remains an enigma, unyielding, unpredictable, and waiting for its next chapter.